second international dialogue of Decolonising Cities, promoted by the University of Padova and Monash University, brought together Naarm-based First Nation artists with Italian academics working in Australia. This video presents key moments from our online seminar in which we discussed how arts and design can challenge ongoing forms of transnational imperialism and the enduring effects of colonialism within specific multicultural localities. Visual artist Dr Paola Balla, Wemba-Wemba, Gunditjmara, and Hayley Millar Baker, Gunditjmara, Djabwurrung, discussed with scholars and activists Pallotta-Chiarolli and Ilaria Vanni how Indigenous and migrant identities are reshaped through engagement with oblique storytelling methods, family histories, autobiographical narratives, art and urban design. In doing so, they shed new light on the complexities of artistic and academic interventions that seek to develop effective practices of transcultural placemaking and inspire and support anti-racist movements.
What we're all here for, and it's so lovely to be here. So thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really honoured and wish we were doing this in person. It would be lovely one day. But I want to deeply acknowledge and thank country where I am. And when I talk about country, I'm talking specifically about the traditional homelands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri peoples where I am now. I'm close to the Maribyrnong River, which recently flooded and is at risk of flooding again. And my family's homelands are currently flooded. So I'm feeling a sense of grief that I'm worried about my family. This is in northeastern Victoria, what's known as Victoria, New South Wales, of unceded sovereign Aboriginal lands, which are Yorta Yorta predominantly and Wemba-Wemba lands. And so it's a really stressful time, and it's, you know, very sobering to keep being reminded of the impacts of climate trauma on our peoples and on the world, in fact. So I really want to pay my respects to traditional owners and elders and custodians who keep country here for us and did so for tens of thousands of years in order for this place to be a place of renewal, a place of culture, and a place where I'm very fortunate to make art and do the research that I do. And I'm really glad to be here with you also. Thank you. I'm really honoured to be here as a sovereign Wemba-Wemba and Gunditjmara woman and as the daughter of a Calabrese migrant. It's something that has been very definitive in my life, the cultures that I was born into. It's a very complex relationship as well between my parents. I'm going to show you some photographs of them. And I'm really honoured to be with this group again. Maria, Joseph, Matteo and Francesco, I loved the opportunities I've had to speak with you and the forum at Kawazit in Naarm, where I began this relationship with you all has really sustained me, and it's given me a new energy in my academic work, which I'm really loving. And it's also giving me a sense of, I'm reluctant to say hope, as Professor Chelsea Watego says here. She says, fuck hope, pardon my language. But I don't believe in pulling any punches when we're talking about the work of decolonising and the horrific realities of racism in this place, in this colony. And this week in particular, we've had some very hard times recently, particularly as Aboriginal people in what's known as the state of Victoria. We've lost some very significant elders recently. Our country is under pressure from the impacts of COVID, the multiple lockdowns we went through. We're still recovering from that. And then also a young Aboriginal boy has been murdered in a race hate crime just in the last, he's passed in the last week, and it's been very devastating. And we've also seen a report released on the horrific numbers of missing and murdered Aboriginal women. So this work continues. So if I say fuck hope, I don't say that lightly at all. And as Professor Watego also talks about, that there is a joy and a strength to be gained from nihilism, from being realistic. So we're not people who are hopeless, and we're not people that don't have black joy, and we're not people that don't live for strength and for collaborations like this. We actually need them, but we're not employing in any toxic positivity, put it that way. we're not believing in carrots that are dangled before us, because as invaded peoples, as sovereign peoples who are occupied, we very much know the reality that we're dealing with. So for me to make art about that work and to do the research with the community I do, particularly at Mundani Balak, which in Wemba-Wemba language means to embrace people. So I work at a really phenomenal Aboriginal academic and student support centre at Victoria University, and I'm really, really well supported there. We are predominantly an all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander unit of teachers and researchers, and we do some really amazing research. And for a small university that isn't highly funded, we as Professor Tony Birch has said, we punch well above our weight because we are very committed to our local community. So it's not only the Kulin Nations community, Bunurong and Wurundjeri community that we work with in the western suburbs of Melbourne, where I am. I'm in a place called Footscray. It's also where I was born. We also are very much committed to the community work that we are really, fortunate to be engaged in with our community through the university and the research projects we do, which include a project called Black Women's Healing, where we are, it's been COVID delayed, but we are working with Aboriginal women inmates at a place called Dame Phyllis Frost, which is the maximum detention centre for women in the state. It has an enormously high number of Aboriginal women inmates, the majority of whom are there for very minor so-called crimes. It's usually to do with the fact that they have experienced violence from their partners, and 79% of Aboriginal women in the state of Victoria are actually with non-Aboriginal partners from a recent survey. So a lot of people assume that it's our men, that it's Aboriginal men who are committing that violence, and in fact it's settler men, it's non-Aboriginal men. And I know that Maria has done this work before and this research about how that happens. And that's part of my complex story with my own parents. It's the reason my mother left my father to survive violence. That's not to say that they haven't had a relationship. My mother's a very strong Black woman. She's a very strong Aboriginal woman who stood up to my father. And it was very, very hard for her, though, to do that. I'm not the only Aboriginal child. I have an Aboriginal mother with a migrant father, a settler father who has inherited the ideas that Aboriginal women are inferior, that we have less rights, that we are less human somehow, that we are less beautiful, less intelligent, less of agency than other women. But the narrative in this country from the earliest establishment of the colony is that Aboriginal women are either for labour or for sexual subjugation. And our status as mothers and as carers is often denigrated. So my work is really focused on the idea of sovereign, matriarchal, Black feminist ways of being. So I draw on a lot of different methodologies and theories, in particular in this place, Professor Aileen Moreton-Robinson and her work in her, iconic book and work, Talking Up to the White Woman, which is really an incredible unpacking of white liberal feminism in this place specifically, and also addresses intersectionality, which we know was coined by Professor, Kimberly Crenshaw in the United States to name the intersections of race, class and gender for Black women in particular. But Professor Aileen Morton's work is very specific to here, to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women's experiences, which is very important to name. And then also I'm very informed by my own family. So that story of identity and lived experience and survival is very informative to me. And I've worked towards translating that into art practice and into my writing. So it often makes me very vulnerable publicly to talk about what are seemingly private stories. But I think that resistance is intensely private and political work, and they come together. And as sovereign Aboriginal people, we have not ceded our sovereignty to anyone, it often means that we have to tell the truth. And so telling our personal truths, and An example of this week has just been the attacks on Senator Lydia Thorpe for telling the truth and being held to account at a level that a white man would never ever be in this country, or a white female politician either. And she's, you know, they're trying to force her to pay the price. And unfortunately, that also means not just white politicians, but other Aboriginal moderates, I would say, politically, who are very uncomfortable with her presence in her truth-telling. So that resistance is, you know, it's a responsibility I take seriously in the work that I do. So what I share in my art is, you know, I have to make very careful choices about what ethically I should or should not share, and how I do that work. This is a very complex map for people that aren't familiar with it. Please look this up later if you wish. It goes into the complexity of our languages here. As sovereign people, as unceded peoples, we have 38 distinct languages just in this what's known as the state of Victoria, named for Queen Victoria, which I don't accept either, but this is sovereign country. This is predominantly Kulin Nations country in the centre of up the centre of what you see is that triangular shape, and that large black line that you see is what was called by white people as the Murray. It's actually Dungala in Yorta Yorta language, and that's what's flooded right now. So if you're seeing that in the news, that's you know, an incredible life source for our people that is raging at the moment and putting people's lives in danger. This is Wemba country, my mother's country, my matriarchal homelands, through my all of my matriarchs 7 generations back. And this is a work where I created a mirror effect of that country. It's currently at threat of flood as well. I had an auntie just texting me this morning telling me to watch a particular website to keep an eye on what's happening. What this means is what we see in the news really is only one version of how the floods impact people, and it's usually on businesses and white people who are getting interviewed. But for us, this is disturbing our burial sites, our sacred sites, our cultural markers, in that the ones that have survived in the landscape in the colonial echo side of country. And as you can see, when I've mirrored this image of this site, which is very close to a women's site in my family, you can see on the ground below it appears like a possum or an animal face. The shadows beneath, which wasn't deliberate, it just appeared. And often when I'm doing this work, when I'm doing bush dyeing practice, which is also a new practice I developed during my PhD, spirit animal faces come to the surface. And my grandmother showed me how to do this as a child. She would say, look for our spirits, look for the ancestors in country. So if we were walking along the river when we were camping, she would tell me to look for their faces in the trees. And so it taught me that our culture is living, that it's embodied, and that our ancestors live with us, that there's no such thing as an inanimate object, for example. This is Mum and Dad in 1971. Just before I was born in 1974, and I was actually born into this place. I was born at the Footscray Hospital, which is just around the corner from where I live. I ended up living back close to my birthplace. You can see some Australian currency from the 1970s on the table, which at that time featured Aboriginal art as well. There are all these signposts in these images that I would love to break down further with you, but I'll run out of time. But this is one of the only images I have. Actually, it is the only photograph I have of my parents together. So my mum left Dad when I was about 2 years of age, taking me back up to live on country with my grandmothers, aunties, cousins and uncles that are featured here. These are my matriarchs, the Aboriginal matriarchs that I was raised by in person. My grandmother Rosie on the far right, who's surrounded by some of her paintings there, and my great-grandmother and great-great-grandmother whose stories and images I lived with and was taught about growing up. So my great-grandmother in the middle was our language keeper. So her name was Nancy Egan, and she was the main informer and collaborative researcher with a linguist called Professor Louise Hercus from the Australian National University, who only passed away very recently in her 90s. And because of the work my great-grandmother and her brother, Uncle Stanley, did with Dr. Hercus, our Wemba-Wemba language was fully documented. And so myself and other family members are always working on reclaiming, renaming our art. So often my artwork will feature Wemba-Wemba language as a form of reclamation. This is me and Mum and my grandmother Rosie in the 1980s in Footscray visiting my father's pizza restaurant. So my mother is probably one of the first Aboriginal women to start an Italian restaurant with my dad in 1974. That restaurant is still there. It is a second home of sorts to me and my family. I've had to really battle my dad emotionally at times, but we've come to a place of, acceptance. And I love him, as children do. You love your parents despite things that they do to hurt you and hurt your loved ones. But I've had to renegotiate how I relate to my father, which is very common for a lot of Aboriginal people with migrant parents. And there's just some more images about the activism that we enact, that we take part in on the streets of this city. These are my children here. The little boy is Caton, who's now 18 and just finished year 12 and doing exams. And on the left is my daughter Rosie, who's 27. And they're both young activists in their own right, even when they don't want to be. They're forced to be. Unfortunately, our children have to become the educators in their own schools and in their own settings. I don't expect you all to read this quote, but I'm happy to share any of this work with you later. But this is just some of the work that's very informative to me during my PhD research that Professor Morton Robinson wrote about and spoke about the concept of relationality. And so it's how we know ourselves as Aboriginal people. We know ourselves through others, and we know others through ourselves. So by placing ourselves, by saying where you're from, what's your family name, what's your language group, what village, what town do you come from? I know in Dad's family, you're talking about the fact that my grandparents left Reggio Monticello and Reggio Calabria is really important that I name that. And so in our culture, being able to name where your family comes from and what your language group is really important. Some of the works I've made over the years sort of address this idea of who I am. I've never felt conflicted. I've never felt confused. I've never described myself as half of anything. I'm not a pizza or a pie. I'm a person. I'm a whole person. I belong to my whole family and community. But there are times when the racism and the violence that I experienced and my family have makes you feel discombobulated. That's what makes you feel unwell. That's what makes you feel disconnected. It's the violence of the impact of that trauma, that colonial violence on your body. And that's what I was trying to capture with this work. And there's a few others that I've done over the years grappling with the impacts of colonialism, particularly on what we know as Aboriginal art. And Richard Bell of Proper Now Collective talks, wrote a fantastic paper in 2001, Bell's theorem about the construct of Aboriginal art as a money-making venture, basically, and that Aboriginal art is, it's a false concept, essentially. It's a false construct. And then just to sort of finish, there's some images of my PhD work. So when I went into this research of looking at how and why our women resist publicly, privately, through community work, through activism, through arts work, whether they're working as teachers or raising children and grandmothers raising grandchildren who've been removed from their parents, it's all the same work. We're all fighting for survival, and we're all fighting for the reclamation and the wholeness of ourselves. So in doing that, I like to create spaces of what I call respite and healing. So these are an attempt at an aesthetic repair, aesthetic healing, healing arts. And so I created these little houses, if you like, which are tributes to the mission houses that our people were placed on during the violent colonisation and dispossession of our homelands. And I've been making different iterations of those through the exhibitions that you mentioned in my bio. So this work is really important to me, and I'll finish with this one because it's a collaboration between myself and my grandmother, despite the fact that my grandmother passed away in 1993 when I was 19, and that was a really devastating loss to me because she was my first art teacher. Her name was Rosie, Rose Tang. Her married name was Tang, as my Chinese great grandfather had also migrated here. In fact, it was my Chinese great-great-great-grandfather, and my grandmother married a gentleman called Bill Tang, who was Irish, Greek, and Chinese. And so my grandmother became a self-taught painter. That's her painting that's in the background. It's printed as a wallpaper, and that is 6 meters wide. Sorry, it's 7 meters wide and 6 meters tall. And that appeared at Tarrawurra Museum of Art in the Willenbeck show that was curated by Wurundjeri woman Stacey Piper for the Willenbeck exhibition, which is now touring the state, which is really exciting. It's currently just opening at another gallery called Wyndham Arts. So I'm making a different iteration of that healing tent each time, and it's really a space for our people to take a moment in. It's a space to challenge non-Aboriginal visitors about what they do or don't know about our experiences and our resistance. And it's a way to name the traumas that we experience in an ongoing way without explicitly referencing them, but to let them rise to the surface. And that's what's in the fabrics that are there. So there's over 250 individual hand-dyed pieces of fabric there that I tie on by hand, and it takes me 3 days to do it. And I realize that each time I do it, I exhaust myself physically and mentally, but it is an act of healing in itself, and an act of, you know, my own take on what it means to create decolonial work in a public gallery, in a public context.
To introduce myself, my name is Hayley Millar Baker. I am a Gunditjmara and Djabwurrung woman from Victoria, Australia, going back thousands and thousands of years. I am an Aboriginal woman on my mother's side. We have a long matriarchal family line, and we are a very, very big family of women. That said, that identity is also mixed with my father's identity, which is equally as important to mention, which he is a first-generation Australian man. His father came to Australia from India in the early 50s, from Moradabad, which is in the state of Uttar Pradesh. He came over here for a better life, to join the Air Force for a better job. And my dad's mother's family migrated to Australia from Brazil. So while I have thousands and thousands of years and a multitude of generations belonging to the country that within Victoria that I grew up around, it is equally important for me to say that I am also the daughter of a first-generation Australian born to immigrants. When I am not in residency at the Monash Prato Centre, I live on Bunurong country and work between Bunurong and Wurundjeri country back in Naarm, Melbourne. I grew up on Wotherong country, which is just on the outskirts and the border of Wurundjeri country, which has now had their land borders change and has now become Bunurong country, which is really interesting with the shift of borders within Victoria of Aboriginal countries changing. I know that my country, Gunditjmara, our borders are also changing. so that's really interesting to be involved and watch the shift of different places that had been, for my entire lifetime, been one country, be negotiated and shifted and handed over to other mobs and become part of their country as they are trying to not reclaim, but I guess correct historical borders and lands. And along with all of that, you know, comes totems and animals and all of that caring for country that would have been traditionally theirs. So that is very interesting. I would also like to note that my Djabwurrung grandfather, Grandpa George Winters, married and had children with a Tanarong woman, and Tanarong mob are also under negotiation with family lines and borders and all of that sort of thing. So that is all to keep in mind when I use the idea of place as an identity marker within my work. I need to be aware of all of these histories and changes and places that contribute to how our identity is formed and how we experience place and what place means to us, and whether my work actually shows place within the work, whether it be a physical image of place, of location, of markers of location, or whether it be a character within the work. All of that is identity and feeds into identity. My PowerPoint is not super extensive. I focused on two bodies of work in particular, which are my two most recent bodies of completed work that have been exhibited recently in 2021 and 2022. Before these works had come out, I had spent 5 years developing quite, I feel like it would be an extensive acknowledgement and respect to my ancestors. And when I say ancestors, I mean, you know, I'm not even talking that far. I'm talking about my mother. I'm talking about my nan. I'm talking about my grandmother. I'm talking about my great-grandmother and their stories. And I say that because Australia has this great amnesia, although it's not amnesia, it's purposeful to not, well, just to sweep our traumas and our experiences under the rug to create this beautiful new pride for Australia, so-called Australia. And so our family stories and intergenerational trauma that follows through within our families, they're very universal. Paola noted the mission that her family stayed on. My family were residents of the Lake Conda Aboriginal Station Mission, just West Victoria, past Warrnambool Way. They were there for several generations. They died very, very young on the station. They were fed alcohol through the fence by police, which led to deaths of my great-great-grandfather. My grandmothers died of TB on the mission in their 30s. They also were sent away as servants and slaves to Melbourne to serve white families. So I think that having done all of this work that is really for my family healing based, when it was and when it has been presented to non-Aboriginal audiences, it was never read in the way that I had intended to make it, as acknowledgements and respects of their story and having their story put down in the history books and collections and to be cared for and looked after and preserved. It ended up on most occasions meaning whenever I did an artist talk or whenever the work was shown, people often trying to argue the point of the stories. Older women had asked my nan, particularly about works about my nan's mother and her grandmother, you know, when will enough be enough? When will the story be enough for us to move past it? And I guess I'm saying all of this because to understand our stories and our history is a very, very complex thing. I feel that no matter how much research and how much listening we do, there's never an undoing of the trauma that is within there. There is only a respect and an acknowledgement that we can give to the lives of our family. So with all of this in our minds right now, I took a bit of a step forward during COVID, during the 2-year lockdown within Melbourne. I think that we were locked down for a total of 260 something days. And it was quite brutal where I was. Only one person could leave the house during the day. And that was to either go to the shop or go for 1 hour of exercise. I was pregnant at the time and had a 2-year-old as well, which made it very, very difficult for me to move and get about. But during this time, there was a really great healing and growth within me of deciding that that I am the author of my stories. And so within this 2-year period, I worked on this series that you can see on the screen now. It's titled I Will Survive. And that is titled after the amazing song, Gloria Gaynor's song, I Will Survive, in a bit of a cheeky way. You know, it's quite a fun disco cheeky song, but then on the flip side, I Will Survive, an Aboriginal woman saying that, coming from a line of Aboriginal people who, up to my nan, you know, didn't live outside of their 30s and 40s and died of very unfortunate circumstances. You know, it's very, very heavy. So when I went into this work, I was revisiting, because I couldn't leave my house. I couldn't physically leave my house because of the lockdown. I was visiting all of these places within my life, particularly within my childhood, that were quite healing for me. There were places of solitude. They were wide open places. I was grounded. The memories in those places for me are just, you know, they're places that I can go to and I'm like, I'm home, even though they're not my country. They're not specifically Gunditjmara country. So when I was making this work, I was thinking of a couple of quotes that I read, which I'll just quickly read to you. Of children constantly are encountering other versions of the past. Different versions can arise unwittingly when conversational partners misremember what happened, but also can occur when they purposely exaggerate or even fabricate details to tell, say, a more glamorous account. Given that memory is constructive, it is within this realm that bits and pieces of the suggestions and stories told by others may find their way into children's recollections of their experiences. Now, this quote was really interesting to me because during the really intense period of making work to give acknowledgement and respect to my family's stories, I was always reading accounts of settlers' journals and a person who was supposed to be the protector of Aborigines at the time. That was his title. And the versions of particular events would never ever align, and you can tell that one person is downplaying it and one person is leaving this out and one person is this, but then we also have the stories handed down within our families and within our communities, which they don't stay true, but I find that they are amplified and exaggerated with stories of shape-shifting, which are very much true, of healers, of magic people, all of these types of things, which are true. But what I was really interested in this particular series was the way that memory changes within ourselves when we revisit a memory. And that is like revisiting a place as well. And so I was looking at the work of Pierre Nora, who goes on to talk about the points where space and time meet memory, and that difference between a site of memory and the real environment of the memory. You can visit the site of a memory of a location, but it is never that exact place within the memory. There are changes and there are evolutions over time. And that also means that if you visit a place where, say, for example, this first image here, I Will Survive, with this very soft, eroded coastal line, you know, if I was to visit a place elsewhere to this exact location, you know, that would trigger a memory from this place within my childhood. So without going on a tangent, I think this series for me sort of unwrapped some healing from my childhood of being within these places and the stories that I was told, stories coming from my mum and my nan of the land, you know, for thousands of years, and how the land has changed and what has eroded and what has developed and whose country we are on. That in comparison with my dad's experience, because we would always go to these places as families, with my dad's experience as a first generation Australian experiencing these places, but making them a significant location for himself, and what that means for me growing up in these places, and creating my own stories based on brand new experience from my father and thousands of generations from my mother. So within these works here, what I've done is I've taken memories of mine from different locations. All of these works here are within different locations throughout Victoria, ranging from the coastline to up in the mountains to in the country to my country. And these different stories and that my family would tell me, my mum and dad and my nan and pa would tell me of cautions to keep safe, and to basically stay alive while we were out bush or out in these terrains where there was nobody else around. And we would stay there for a couple of weeks and camp or fish, and just do all of these other things. So all of these stories of bush witches, of panthers in the bush stalking us, of giant sharks that would jump out of the water to get us, and how these stories formed my memory as a child, and looking back now as an adult, and how that kept me safe in those areas. And that's nothing new. Storytelling is central to Indigenous people. Our stories always have a moral or lesson to be learned or a caution, as does Indigenous people of Brazil, Indigenous people worldwide. So bringing all of these stories into a contemporary context for me now, this is me in all of these works here, and using myself as the character and the beacon to carry those memories and those stories of how I remember the land and the story and these places, I think for me, it was quite a healing process. So second to that work, and leading on from there, I don't think I have too much time left. I'll quickly get into these. So this work is Nick Dynasty, and this was created, it was commissioned by the National Gallery of Australia for the 4th Indigenous Art Triennial, curated by Hetty Perkins, who is an absolute, she's a leading Aboriginal curator. She's a wizard. She's incredible. And the theme for the exhibition was ceremony. And so once again, I've looked within myself for this work and seen myself as a contemporary sovereign woman, in a place of, I live in the suburbs, I live a contemporary life, and how traditional ceremony looks to contemporary Aboriginal people, and going back to the shapeshifters and the magic people and the healers and all of those people, those things within our bloodline do not leave us. Although we were taken from our place and put onto missions and tried to be bred out and tried to be domesticated and all of these different things, all of this magic that Aboriginal people hold within themselves, and I'm going to go ahead and say particularly Aboriginal women, that still exists today. And so this work, Nick Dynasty, really centers female power within the contemporary place. And so this whole work is centered within the domestic space, within a home. There is no indication of where that home is. It is just this one woman within her home space, within her own space, undertaking this ritual of connecting to spirits and ancestors, and just really being within her power. And there's a lot of, I like to watch people watch this, because it's interesting to see the difference between non-Aboriginal people and non-Indigenous people watch this and get a bit of the, get a bit of the creeps, and it leaves a bit of an eerie feeling. But then watching Indigenous people watch it, I can just see like the smile on their face and recognizing, and yeah, I know that. So it was very interesting watching this come out and seeing how people react to a very blatant message of saying that Aboriginal people still have our magic, we still have our connections, whether it be on country or off country, that, that spirit of country, that spirit of being, that spirit of identity, place, of all of our ancestors still live within us, no matter where we are and no matter how extended time becomes and removes us from, we talk about great grandparents, but for us, that's an ancestor, but that is so closely related to who we are. They are within us. So that work speaks to that. And I think going forward, I really find power in the power of magic women within our Aboriginal communities, and being within that power and owning that power. And yeah, so I will follow that forward and have upcoming projects where I'm extending on that, but also coming into the acknowledgement of agony and just the strength within agony, because with power and with all of this, there's always combined with agony.
I do also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country, their enduring sovereignty, unceded, and I bear witness to their diversity, strength and resilience, and honour the elders past and present. And this is an image, and this is the project, my part of the project that I am doing in collaborations with First Nations, First Peoples and Greeks, Italians, and Maltese. I'm calling it Stories of Strength Survival. Loved your work with that, Hayley. Absolutely. The story of survival and suitcases. And this will be the cover of the book with permission from Auntie Annette Shibaris. This is in her backyard. And this is an image by my partner, but it really, for her, encapsulates herself and her Maltese heritage, the message stick, the totems. So what I want to do today is just talk a little bit about the processes, and I'm always open to critique. That's just part and parcel of what I do and how I do it, and just take you into how does a non-Aboriginal WOG, working class WOG, come to do this work, and how partial it is. So I can only give you little fragments today, but it's an absolute pleasure to keep doing this work, and very uncomfortable. The discomfort I have to sit with, and that's part and parcel of what I'm doing. Now I'm just trying to get it to work. Oops, this way. Okay, so I'm going to take you through some of the stuff, just project questions that I think are really, really important and for what we're doing. So basically, first of all, permission from Auntie Annette, Wurundjeri elders, who discussed it with other elders for me to do this work, with very strong parameters on what I can do, where I cannot go with this work. And I think that is very important to set that permission. So I'm asking, what are the distinct or unique aspects of growing up with blended First People Southern European families? And how can this heritage impact upon experiences in schools, communities, work, places of worship, the wider society? So like Paola, who her work has absolutely inspired and encouraged me, definitely looking at issues such as Christian missionaries, looking at the missionaries that came from other countries, from Greece in the Orthodox Church, from Italy, of course, New Norcia, all of that. Secondly, what role did Southern European migrants play in influencing and allowing, as well as questioning, confronting racist and colonial ideologies on a whole range of levels? Because there are some stories that are absolutely fraught and complex and devastating. And then there are some stories of incredible strength and pulling together. Is there evidence that the Southern European migrants imported colonial and racial attitudes and convictions? So, for example, I've been doing a lot of, as Gary Foley says, truth tell about your own backyard, really, before you go around talking about everybody else's. Part of the project is also to interrogate the work I've done in the past and decolonize that and critique that for what I didn't say. And I'm delving into a lot of the work a lot of the horror that happened in North Africa under fascism. And that's part and parcel of, we hear the good old narrative of the good Italian who comes to Australia to set up a new life and become, as Anne Courtois says, and becomes part of this Australia. And we hear about poverty and devastation, but we don't hear about this national fascism that actually devastated some Italians along the way. And is there evidence of these attitudes learned from employers? I mean, my mum did migrate to Australia in 1956. She's now nearly 90. Asking my mum what were the first words she learned to call Aboriginal people. I don't want to repeat them. They were horrific. So using language to position migrants into a particular narrative or stereotype of Aboriginal people that she then has to undo and try not to pass on to her children. In what ways do Southern European migrants counter or resist colonial racist attitudes? And this is something that I'm doing at the moment, which is the last part of this project before the final draft gets pulled together. How do migrant memorial monuments and heritage recognise or erase First Peoples? And we give some examples of that. So they're the overall pictures. And thank you, Paola, because you've pointed out the incredible significance of Eileen Morton Robinson's work, Indigenous standpoint research methods, that the entry into this research is really how First Peoples want to enter into this research. I do not believe in the word post-colonialism. There is no such thing as post-colonialism. I think that's another whole area of study that needs to be really contested. We are in a neo-colonialism and it's ongoing coloniality. And as you said, with Senator Lydia Thorpe, couldn't agree more. We're seeing it over and over again. And Linda Tuiwai-Smith's wonderful Māori researcher, And her issues are very important to us. The work has to be accessible. So I'm actually going to do away, and I'll certainly be picked up on it if my work is academic and inaccessible. It's got to be able to sit on my mum's kitchen table, really, and be, you know, gone through by everyone. Participants have the right to speak about, support, or critique the work publicly. They own everything we've produced together. They own everything that's going to come out of this text. And they have the right to use the materials and stories in the development of their own projects. Now, we've actually done away with the word participant. I'm just quoting Linda Tuiwai-Smith there. We are all co-researchers. This is a co-researched book. This is any royalties that come from this book are going to be shared with everyone. And then after I finish my part of this research, it gets handed over to everyone in the book to do what they want. And I know there's some great ideas around art exhibitions and docos. That is not for me to do. This is the part that I do. And we are all working on this together. And every single draft, right up to publication, which I think by December I'll have it the whole draft ready again, is going to be critiqued and passed around for everyone to approve. Michael Savas talks about storytelling reconciliation, and Paola's work, Hilary's work, you know, the importance of story, the importance of disseminating those stories. And does it achieve reconciliation? Hilary, you've really made me think about that today. And I think those are the issues that are ongoing. And Joseph Pugliese's work, as well as Francesco Rigati's work around, and many other people like Robert Pascoe, you know, let's look at migrant heritage projects and what are they not doing and how are they colonial formations as well. So that's a little bit of an insight. For me, and for all of us in this, it's become relationship. We are a group of people that have been working together for years. I'm the one that seems to be the most anxious about time, this Western construct of deadlines, rah, rah, rah. And I'm told to chill out, because along the way, the projects are happening in lots of different ways. So every contributor to this project, every co-researcher has used this project already to launch into their own projects, to achieve their own goals. I love that. So it's coming along. It also means that when my dad died, when my daughter got cancer at 30, and all sorts of other horrible things happened at Deakin, bureaucracy, I was supported. I was told, it's okay, we're all getting on with it anyway, without you. Love that, very important. So we're all co-researchers. We are trying, as far as possible, avoid exploitation and appropriation, especially from external bodies. I will be an ally, and I actively support the community, First Nations communities, and will not just write something for the publication tick, but will be actively. I also reflect on my own reactions, my anger, my frustration, the truth-telling, the reinterrogation of my own culture. And again, I cannot stress enough, everything in that book, everything leading up to it, every single document, every native title, land claim, every photo is not mine. It belongs always. And that was a point of contention with a university. And so just a few other things. This is another model that I use very much from South America on that Mexican First Nations border with the US colonizer. We have to be trustworthy. We have to earn that trust and be credible. We need to become informed. And so one of the things that my job has been is, after an interview, after working together with someone and developing a story with a co-researcher, my job is to do the research. Okay, let me go back and find something. Let me go back and look at the archives. Let me find some readings that I will give to you and see what you think. So I do that background, you know, sometimes tedious work, but that's my work. I didn't live these experiences. So the story is then supported by what's out there and what's not being said out there, and a commitment. Once the project ends, it doesn't end. As long as people still want to talk to me, the commitment is there ongoingly to continue this work. And I think I've gone through those, so I'll keep moving. As I said, everything is not owned by me. And we also have to return to the community something of value. So this project, I hope, is very important and useful for First Peoples and ethnic settler colonizers. So I'm going to take you into 3 stories because I don't want to run out of time, and it's really important for Q&A. This is Auntie Annette Shiberis. Paola may know, I don't know if Hayley, if you know Auntie Annette Shiberis, Wurundjeri elder, and her mother grew up in Corandurk, and her grandmother and family, so they were pushed out of Corandurk. These are some of the images, Annette, of course, everything you see today I have approval for, and that's again, and is owned by Annette. That's her grandmother on Corandurk being taught Japanese culture while their own culture and language has been totally erased. So we go right into those border fraught complexities. And of course, you know what you said, Hayley, about memory, you know, so when you're a child, you may enjoy this. You think it's fun, you're dressing up. But when you look back as someone with adult knowledge of what was done to your culture, your family, this photo is extremely difficult to look at. There's Auntie Annette with her partner, Kathy, who unfortunately passed away young, and their children. But there's also a progression. So there's Auntie Annette's children now who are learning traditional dance, who are really exploring and owning their culture. So as I said, I can only give you little fragments of the thing. Here's some of the border complexities. So there's her dad's Maltese fruit trees in the backyard in Lara, outside of Geelong. On the other hand, in the shed, and there's her Bunjalin totem, her partner's snake totem, and apologies, I've forgotten it. But unfortunately, also in the shed sit these images of Catholicism, the remnants of missionary, remnants of Corandurk. And so again, Annette explores the complexities between and within all these images of the self and the past, and the thing, and the beauty and the love her father actually had. And her father was often taken to be Aboriginal, and he accepted that, and he would go around the back of the pub to drink with all the other Aboriginal people because he refused to be seen as a Maltese when his wife, and he also wanted his children to say they were Wurundjeri, not Maltese. This is one of the latest projects I've been doing. I've been visiting places, and I call this part of the work the prison on the prison. So I've been going to Cowra, the prisoner of war camp, where my uncle, you can see him in the little black sketchy thing on the side there. He was a prisoner of war. And again, there's a whole history behind that. In Cowra, the camp is heralded as some kind of tourist site. You know, go and have a look where the Japanese did their breakout. You know, go and look at the 5 or 6 Australian soldiers that were shot, etc., etc. And I'm not trivializing that. And then throughout the camp, you've got, you know, the Italians, and you see these amazing images of Italians working, Italians out on farms, Italians making sugo, Italians setting up their own fountain, making their own shoes. What we're not seeing, and here I get very angry, what we're not seeing in the prisoner of war camp is that the fact that there was the Arambi mission across the Lachlan River. And the Arambi mission, Wiradjuri people mainly, incredible stories that now Lawrence Bamblett did put together. But in everything I was reading and seeing about this prisoner of war camp, the erasure of who was there already and on whose land. And even most recently, you can see 2 of the statues, 2 of the monuments, as Joseph Pugliese would say. There is nothing that acknowledges on anything in Cowra that this is Wiradjuri land, that Cowra is on a mission land. And I spoke to Stassi Austin, who's a descendant, and Stassi said this is a major point of contention for the Wiradjuri people still living in Cowra. And I put a call out the other night in COASIT event where we talked about this. When are Italians, including myself, going to actually protest and do something with the Italian ministry, who signed off with that lovely little sculpture of a handshake there, but, you know, about acknowledging the land and acknowledging the people. And in the bookshop, there are 2 books that talk about this. Tom Keneally, yes, very well-known Australian writer. Now, his book, Shame and the Captives, is about 400 pages long. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but there is not one mention of a Arambi mission, not one mention of an Aboriginal person in that whole book about Cowra camp. It took Anita Hayes, who's a descendant of the Wiradjuri and Arambi, to write her book looking at the Italian prisoners from the perspectives of the Wurundjeri living there and the so-called protector and all the rights they did not have that these so-called Italian prisoners had. So that's another example of this decolonizing historiography. And one of my tasks, I hope, will be to gather some more influential people than myself to actually do something about this. And the final story is, and thank you, Francesco, for working with me on this one, a Greek family on Aranda country. So this is seen from a migrant. So this young child, Kim Dracopoulos, his Athenian family arrives in Australia. They help set up the Greek Orthodox Church. And then they decide to buy what was called Maryvale Station, which is where Tikikala now is. And I'm delighted to have been given permission in about a week and a half. I'll be going to Tikikala to see the town and to see what's left of the Maryvale Station and how through the native land title claim, it has now gone back to the Aranda. And the amazing person you see there with Kim, that's Big Alan Lidiarada, and his granddaughters have taken back the land. Now, this came through the project. We explored native titles, we connected with people. Kim had the story of growing up, and you can see him there eating, he's holding up a witchetty grub, he's eating witchetty grubs, and of course, he says stereotypically his Greek family had to have the lemon tree. But he grew up speaking 5 languages, and the translanguaging that Francesco taught me about, you know, here's a child who knows Greek, English, Pitijara, I think it was Lauritia, excuse me, and Aranda, and his upbringing. Apparently the place made some news, and I'll be finishing off after this, Matteo. Please let me know if I've gone over time now, because I'll finish even quicker. I'm good? Oh, thank you. So apparently this meeting of Greek migrants who themselves were being harassed, and the racism that was happening from white station owners and the horror of what station owners were doing was actually reported in an Adelaide paper from 1962. And I mean, again, I'm so sorry about the language used here, but this kind of reporting. And then we found images of Auntie Carolyn Briggs, who actually went to visit what was so different about, now not making this sound out to be perfect place, it's a station. But what was really interesting is that for some reason this drew attention that these wogs had arrived from a city in Greece and suddenly took up, but they refused to comply to certain white, patriarchal, misogynist, racist ways of doing things. So what's left in Tikikala, apparently some of the buildings, the houses, the school, the shops, the tennis courts. And at the bottom there is Annalise Dracopoulos, just to show you the generational shifts. Now, Annalise became a pilot, and her job is, she's gone back. Kim lives in Sydney now, but Annalise has gone back to that land, and she flies predominantly Aboriginal children and First Nations families from hospitals to sports clubs and things like that. So that's a little bit of a fragment of that, that project. Annette Shiberas, I just want to say, the way I do this work isn't new. It has got me into trouble in the past. This is the kind of way that I was taught to work when I was working with AGMC on living and loving in diversity, where again, that is a book that we produced, and Auntie Annette actually wrote a welcome to the book, because we needed to explain to anyone reading these stories that there is a difference, a very significant difference between multicultural Australia and colonial Australia. And Auntie Annette positioned herself within that, did a welcome to book, but also talked about why First Nations stories weren't in this book. So I really recommend a reading of her personal story. And again, that book is an example of, it belongs to AGMC, it doesn't belong to me. The royalties are shared, everyone owns everything, and we are all still, over 60 contributors, participants, we're all still together and talking about wherever the book pops up.
My name is Ilaria Vanni, and I am very sorry not to be there virtually in person. So I'm sending this recording, and I am recording from sand dunes and wetlands country midway between Kamai and Warran. And I acknowledge all Aboriginal peoples, Gadigal, Darawal, Darug, Bidjigal, Wongal, and many more who have cared and care for this country. I cannot give you one particular name because this was a refuge on the route between Kamai, Botany Bay, and Warran, Sydney, Cove. So many different people met in this particular place. So I pay my respect to elders and knowledge holders, past, present, and emerging. And I also pay my respect to country, plants, animals, and humans, sky, air, water, and all their interrelations. And this respect for interrelations and country translates into our work and travels through our research. I say our because this is a collaborative project between me and Alexandra Crosby. We have been working together for a very long time as Mapping Edges Research Studio, and Shannon Foster, who is a Dharawal Eora knowledge holder and also a traditional owner of Sydney, the Sydney area. And also we collaborate with Ella Cutler, who is an illustrator and visual communication designer, and who provides the beautiful illustrations for all our work, really. So it is a communal effort. So I came here from Tuscany, and I pretty much think of myself as an uninvited migrant in this land. And this informs how I, how I try to be, to know, to move around in a respectful way on country. Particular country I'm talking about today is known as Green Square. This is what Green Square looked like according to the City of Sydney in 2022 in February. And it's a site of urban redevelopment. And we think that in Green Square, as in other places of urban renewal, attention to how place is articulated, who does the articulation, is crucial to avoid unmaking place or the substitution of an existing place with what is perceived to be a better version of itself. This approach to place as a series of replacement is a problem in Green Square because as a site of urban redevelopment is perceived as a place in becoming unfinished, unstoried, replacing the industrial heartland with the post-industrial heartland of Sydney, and now replacing that with residential blocks. And just to be clear, we don't think that development is bad in itself, but that its premises are problematic sometimes. So our friends and collaborators, Shannon Foster and Joanne Kennyberg, working together as Bangawarra, use the term tabula rasa, the clean slate on which to build anew, to describe the continuation of colonial erasure of Indigenous knowledges in the urban landscape. Tabula rasa is the modernist equivalent of terra nullius. It imagines place as empty. Tabula rasa, therefore, creates a development and future-oriented imaginary of place, which contributes to an erasure of Indigenous knowledges and histories and social environmental processes and memories of place. And this also contributes to an erasure of connections between people and their environment, and a loss of sense of place, a loss of agency. And this is problematic, clearly, and there are several reasons. The main ones are that connections can inspire stewardships and care initiatives, including around water, and the multiplicity of history and processes that make place is buried in favor of a very unmoored here and now. So the project that I'm presenting today focuses on the histories of water as a viewfinder to understand the social environmental histories of Green Square and how these histories bear upon the present. And we focus on water not only because it has shaped Green Square, but also as a reminder that non-human elements are part of making place. So we hope to create an inverse imaginary to the tabula rasa, to unflatten the tabula rasa, if you wish, and produce some tools to make place more alive and more meaningful. We start with this image, which is two maps from the late 1880s, and they map ephemeral ponds around Green Square, which by the beginning of the 20th century had disappeared. They had been channeled underground. And with this channeling underground, is undergrounding social environmental histories and indigenous knowledges disappeared from the surface, and also connections were severed. So we address water visibility in the urban landscape by researching and developing a story map that brings local water stories to the surface. So this paper presents the way we, in a way, very, very quickly, we went about researching the story map. So our research question in general is really how can we create stronger connections between people and their environments in urban settings, and especially we've been working on Sydney. So to do this, we bring together a number of different methods. We are working pretty much on transdisciplinary projects, and each one of us has developed a particular skills, but they are all pretty much interdisciplinary, to be honest. So we have archival research, we do primary resource analysis, ethnography when it's possible, a lot of working around visual communication, and we design artifacts such as the story map. So we think about place as an archive, and sometimes we read the archive against the grain, trying to understand what becomes visible in the gaps. So for instance, what you're looking at here is a swamp lily that grows on a pond designed by the City of Sydney on the site of the original wetlands. So this swamp lily is a local native plant, and it is for us. It is a reminder that under so much concrete there is always country. And when we walk with Shannon Foster, she guides us to understand how we can not only read place as an archive, but how we can recognize country in the middle of urban development. Or we could also read, read place along the grain as an archive along the grain, and understand the different historical economical power structure that shape this archive. For instance, this is a visual communication campaign for luxury apartments, and we do photograph it together with kangaroo grass, just as a reminder that yes, there is the along the grain narrative, but also a very strong against the grain narrative that is present in the same place. And we try and patch together different stories from this archive and create an inverse archive, for instance, collecting what is left outside and discarded, like this, documenting the presence of invisible, so to speak, water infrastructures and tiny ecosystems that are generated by these infrastructures. Our archive is animated by objects, by fragments such as fragmentary maps that we may find and fragmentary stories, and we patch them together a bit like detective trying to solve a mystery. So one of the objects that inspires us is the stormwater drain. So we're talking about objects that are present in the landscape. They're there, and for us, they start as prompts to storytelling. And this is, this is then reflected in the map. And I'm going to take you to the story map now and show you how it works. So this is our story map. You find it at waterstories.info. And you see this illustrations on the map itself and these little roundels. And each one of these illustrations is a portal. It's an object in the landscape that takes you into another time, into another place, and into another story. A bit like Harry Potter portkeys. You touch it and you are transported somewhere else. So I'm going to take you here, Gunditjmara Park. So you just click through, and you get to the actual story from the map. And the story, basically you just scroll and you've got fragments of text that interface with images. So we start with the story of Marai, which was an ephemeral artwork by Djabwurrung. And we start from here because, when we think about decolonial practices, one of the things that we can do as researchers is to foreground Indigenous knowledges by doing research, reading, and citing Indigenous scholars. It's a good thing to do because we cannot always go and ask our Indigenous colleagues for help because it adds to their workload, and it's not a good thing to do. So reading, we can read. We are researchers, so that's one of the things we can do. Read and cite, good citation practices. We also decided to always have scrolling in the middle words in Djabwurrung that are related to water. So in every story, there are words that pop up. And you can, I'm not going to read the stories here, I will just tell you the story of the name, which is Gunditjmara, which according to the city of Sydney means the wind from the southwest. And there were indeed strong winds, there are still strong winds from the southwest that bring with them a really distinct smell, or brought with them rather, a very distinct smell. And it was first the smell of mud and mangrove and stagnant water. And then as soon as the place was colonized, and this was one of the first areas to be, developed around Sydney with noxious strains, the smell of noxious strains just kind of swept through what is today Green Square. And there is another word which is associated with Gunditjmara, which is Gunditjmara, which actually means stink. So it's a funny name for an aquatic center. So the story of the noxious straits and the, if you want, colonization of the landscape and destruction of the environment goes here together with this story of recreation of habitat. What you're seeing here is the Eastern Banksia scrub, which was the plant community in this area. And with habitat come, birds and insects, other animals. So it is quite an interesting way to think about place, to think about how different stories meet and merge together to form place. And I will finish here. I thank you very much for having me. And if you want to be in touch, that's my email address, ilariavanni@uts.edu.au, and you can have a look and wander through the story map, just looking at waterstories.info. Water story is just one word.
Carrying through stories within our family You know, that's obviously a cultural practice, but also into art now. I think that it, the way that I think of it is that my existence is literally pure luck. Like the fact that I exist, and that Gunditjmara country was specifically a very, it had a lot of massacres and genocide during the start of colonization. There's a book by Ian D. Clarke called Scars in the Landscape, where it details so many massacres within Gunditjmara country. And, you know, it was a pure luck that all of my grandmothers and grandfathers had their children within a couple of years of dying then, you know, so then their kids would grow up without parents, but, you know, they existed, and then they had kids and then died when their kids were young as well. So I think for the fact that our existence is pure luck, our family lines that exist and that survived is pure luck, sort of helps to understand on our behalf, I guess, the difficulties of existing, but also trying to get across, again, within so-called Australia, you know, nobody likes to talk about these things. Nobody likes to talk about them. Nobody likes to know about them. To know about them and talk about them is to accept them and accept that as truth, which Australia will not do, because truth is then ownership. And they do not want ownership because, you know, Australia is the lucky country. It's perfect. It was, you know, discovered and, you know, made into this beautiful country, a place with cities and, you know, all things abundant. So I guess using the very real facts and stories and people within our work gives us a strength to push back against that colonial narrative, and not correct it, but literally just push it back, I think. And so, and then again, when I go back to talking about my work with memory and time and experience and all of these things, you know, all of that for me wouldn't have happened without my mother and father, and all of that wouldn't have happened without their mother and father. So I cannot exist without anything that has come before me, you know. So there's no break between me and ancestors and family story and those narratives within the art. It's all just one big, I don't even know how to explain it. We're just all together. We're all together, and yeah, there's no pulling apart each bit because it all bleeds into each other.
Look, there are pitfalls, I think, especially if you're a Southern European settler colonizer and you're trying to tell the family histories of ethnic settler colonizers, because you don't want a pedestal. Like, I know Francesco and I, with Kim Dracopoulos, talking about his family on Arunda land, owning a station, that is colonization. And I went back and researched the history of what happened on that station. And uncomfortable times, like, you know, his dad, Con Dracopoulos, actually scratched his name onto a sacred site. You know, so it's not about pedestaling. And this is something Annette and I talk about, but, you know, what are some of the things, some of the friendships or relationships that came through? So for me, the pitfall is about navigating that space and taking leadership from First Peoples in this project about representation, about family history. And Hayley, exactly what you said, like, it's all interconnected. It's and it's so important, you know. It's also a pushback. I love your word. It's also a pushback against systems. And in Cowra, that is so obvious. All these monuments, all this tourism set up around this prisoner of war camp. and the absolute absence systemically in an economic industry to say, this is the mission and this is what happened here beforehand. And someone spouted as Australia's great writer, Tom Keneally, could not find space in 400 pages to actually acknowledge. So it's a pushback against systems as well.
I just want to mention about what you were just saying, Maria, about of, I guess, not overriding with immigrant stories, but I think what I've learned over the past few years, when I was talking about earlier, the difficulties that I had with non-Indigenous people challenging my work, I guess, from colonial perspectives, rather than taking in an offered narrative and an offered story. You know, it was guards up, I'm pushing back against this. And also, you know, it was a lot of colonial people from the actual country, from Gunditjmara country, that the stories are formed from, where they would come up to me, they would make their way to talks or exhibitions of mine to specifically tell me up front, no, I remember when I was a child, the mission was scary. Our parents would threaten to send us there to get eaten by the Aboriginal people. You know, this is a time that my great-grandmother was on the mission, you know, things like that. And they would push back against narratives and try to implement their own, and that their own be right. You know, but I think at the end of the day, and what I've learned through all of that, is the importance of everybody's stories, you know, and that goes into what I was saying before of this big bubble. There's no disconnecting me from any of my family members, no matter how far back, you know, but that also happens with, you know, anybody who's in wider Australia who has come here as an immigrant. You know, our stories interconnect and bind in, you know, some time, place, way. There's no right, there's no wrong, but I do think that everybody's stories are very important. You know, that story that you were just saying of the man scratching his name into the sacred site, while that is absolutely disgusting, you know, that family need to reckon with that act. And they need to own that act, and there's no turning away from that act, you know. And so hiding stories and being submissive about them and pushing them aside, you know, that's the Australian agenda. You know, all stories are important in bringing together all of these truths. And so for people who have got, I guess, more dangerous or violent stories in the way, I say that in the way of colonialism, and people who come from families that, you know, maybe came to Australia and were involved in genocide, that were involved in clearing the land, which was removing, massacring Aboriginal people to build their houses. You know, they have to own that, and they have to reckon with that. And, you know, there's no space for not including those stories, I think. You know, not highlighting them and not prioritizing them at all. But yeah. I would say the first steps are educating yourself, not asking First Nations people to be to answer all of the questions for you, not for them to do any of the heavy work and the teaching. But there are actually some really great Instagrams where they talk about how to be a good ally. I know that Clothing the Gaps do one. And it talks about what's respectful, what's not respectful, what's helpful, what's not helpful, you know, because a lot of things may seem helpful and may seem like you're coming from a good place, but they actually cause more damage. Or you could be taking up the space and voice of a First Nations person. So there are a lot of, literally, if you typed into Google how to be a good ally to First Nations people, I'm sure that there would be like an abundance of links that would come up, because it's a really common question of late. And there are a lot of resources being made quite quickly to answer those questions, so it doesn't fall on the backs of First Nation Aboriginal people to answer and walk settler people through.
In terms of collecting stories and supporting stories, yeah, Hayley, exactly. There's so much emotional labor in just telling your story over and over again.
It's so heavy, and I've come to a point where you know, I get invited to lectures all the time for universities, and I get invited to tell the stories of my family members, and it's you know, I've come to a point where it's I actually can't. Like, how many times do you want me to keep reliving this? And yeah, sorry, go on.
No, absolutely, I agree with you. I think it's frustrating, because it's like you know, with our project, someone tells a story and they also ask the questions, then it's my job as an ally to go and do the research, go and find out more. It's, you know, so if I can ease a little bit of that by doing that background education, by doing that information, by running things past people, rather than expecting this ongoingness, I think. And then, of course, you know, the right for everyone to go, thank you, you've launched me off into this project. Now I'm going to take this because I need to find out who my birth father was, or I need to do this. That's my journey. And whether they come back to this project or not. So I think, and I think avoiding that emotional labor, Hayley, is so important for many of our project co-researchers, and handing over some of the more research stuff, which is what I'm trained to do, is really important, but also activism. So at the moment, 2 of the stories, one is being used to push back, to fight a particular hospital here in Naarm that has been absolutely appalling to an Italian woman and her Gunditjmara partner, and also a South Australian police force who was absolutely abhorrent. So also the activism, you tell the story, but you know the story is actually going to be put to use.